Listen, just one more thing.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of episode 2 of season 6 of Colombo, Old-Fashioned Murder. First broadcast on the 28th of November 1976 on NBC. It was written by returning writers Peter S. Feebleman, who also appears as Milton Schafer in the episode, and Peter S. Fisher. It was directed by Robert Douglas. Robert Douglas Finlayson was born on the 9th of November 1909 in Buckinghamshire, England. He studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts and began his professional acting career in 1927. As an actor, he generally played character roles in such films as 1950's Kim, 1952's Ivanhoe, or in The Prisoner of Zenda, also in 1952, and would work consistently throughout the 50s, moving into television in the 60s and 70s, including an appearance in Columbo as the Doctor in Troubled Waters. In the 60s, he moved into directing, mainly for television, including this episode, but also directing some films, including 1964's Night Train to Paris, starring former Colombo guest star Leslie Nielsen. He died on the 11th of January 1999. He was 89. This episode has quite a complex plot, with a lot of subtext and some unusual plotting, so I'm going to have to approach my review slightly differently than usual. Let's start with the main characters. Ruth Lytton, played by returning actor Joyce Van Patten, runs a museum left to her and her siblings by her mother. Her brother Edward looks after the finances. He's played by fellow returning actor Tim O'Connor. Her sister Phyllis is more hands-off. Edward wants to sell off the museum as it's making a loss, but Ruth is against this. Phyllis's daughter Janie also works at the museum, and she has employed a shiftless security guard, Milton Schafer, because she's having an affair with his brother, Dr. Tim Schafer. Janie is played by Jeannie Berlin, recently seen in the hit show Succession as Sid Peach. Milton is also stealing artifacts to pay off his gambling debts, which Ruth knows about but doesn't turn him in because she is going to blackmail him to rob the museum for the insurance.
I need you
What for?
to arrange a robbery, for which I'll pay you $100,000 in cash.
There's a lot of information here, delivered over a short period of time, but it's done so much better than in the previous episode. Even though most of this information is delivered in dialogue, the setup and the backstory and relationships just seem much more natural and conversationally delivered. As part of Ruth's plan, Milton calls his brother, who is with Janie, and mistakes it for a call from his wife and leaves it to go to a message on his answer phone. Milton leaves the message pretending he's in trouble and ending the call with a gunshot, setting up his apparent death before he flees the country under the assumed name on the fake passport Ruth is going to give him. It's maybe a little unrealistic that Ruth was able to procure a fake passport, so do let me know if it was much easier to get fake passports in the 70s. Milton then breaks into the museum, not realising that Edward is still there, recording the inventory, which of course Ruth was well aware of, and he goes about robbing the items on the list Ruth provided for him, only to be interrupted by Ruth, who proceeds to shoot him. Edward comes to investigate the noise, and Ruth shoots him too. This was her elaborate plan to save the museum all along, and it looks like, once again, a murder has been set up pretty perfectly. But, as we know, there's no such thing as the perfect murder. That's just an illusion. She sets the scene and leaves, instinctively switching the light switch off as she goes. We cut to Colombo the next day, listening to the message with Dr. Schafer, who laments the fact that he didn't answer. The police have contacted Ruth, and she's set up her excuse that Edward fired Milton the previous morning, and that Edward is still asleep after a long night recording the inventory. Colombo is also suffering with allergies. The doctor offers him an antihistamine, but he refuses as it makes him drowsy. I only mention this because, as a fellow hay fever sufferer, I know exactly how Colombo feels. Colombo goes to see Ruth and is confronted by a very strong-willed woman. She entirely controls the situation and is as cool as a cucumber. She comments that her sister is not so composed and would faint if she found out Colombo was a homicide detective. She also has some chamomile tea brought to Colombo for his allergies. Janie comes in and Colombo asks how she came to employ Milton, which she makes an excuse for.
It's all right, dear. You can tell him.
Why, I just put an ad in the paper and he applied and he...
Good morning.
They are then joined by Phyllis, who does indeed faint when it's revealed Colombo is a homicide detective.
This is Lieutenant Colombo of Homicide.
Phyllis is played by Celeste Holm. Holm was born on the 29th of April 1917 in New York. Her acting career began on stage, quickly moving to Broadway and then to film, signing with 20th Century Fox in 1946. Here she would make impact in such films as Gentleman's Agreement and All About Eve, but chose to remain mostly in theatre. She would still appear in film, including High Society and Tom Sawyer, and also television, such as here in her appearance in this episode, but her first love was always theatre. In later life she would occasionally crop up in film and television, as Jack's mother in Three Men and a Baby, or Grandmother Gaines in Cheers. She died on the 13th of July 2012. She was 95. Ruth's plan continues as she and Janie open the museum, and she lets Janie discover the two bodies, which clearly disturbs her. Ruth is a cold woman. Colombo arrives on the scene, having told other officers to leave it as they found it, which means that some of the lights are still off. This appears to be Ruth's first mistake, for as cunning as she was getting Janie to find the bodies, if she'd done it, she could have put the lights on. Colombo finds that Milton is wearing rubber covers on his brand new shoes, and he's wearing new clothes and has had a haircut, vaccinations, and a new watch, which Colombo thinks is set to the wrong date, but it turns out Colombo's watch is the one that's wrong. Here we get to see Colombo doing his best Sherlock Holmes as he observes all the details. That evening, Colombo is alone at the museum with Ruth, who brings him another chamomile tea, and indicates that he's been there all day.
You've been here for quite some time, Lieutenant.
Another glimpse of Colombo's process, spending a long time thinking. Ruth reveals that she was engaged to Peter Brandt as a young woman, but it was her older sister Phyllis who ended up marrying Brandt and having Janie, causing Colombo to nearly choke on his tea.
She married him.
We don't normally get this sort of character history in Colombo, and it's serving two purposes, potentially hinting that she might have killed Peter, and showing why Ruth has become so ruthless. Colombo reveals that he found a note with directions on it and surmises Milton was going to leave the country after offloading the stolen artefacts, and was likely meeting someone at the museum because he didn't have a passport on him. Ruth attempts to come up with an excuse, which almost certainly arouses suspicion in Colombo, especially as he then explains it would have been impossible for the shooting to take place how it seemed, because the room was in darkness. So there must have been a third person who committed the murder, and turn the lights off. Falk plays Colombo very differently in his scenes with Van Patten. In this episode, he doesn't attempt to use any of his usual tricks on her to get her to lower her guard. Instead, he's much more quiet, almost as if he's inviting her to confess each time he brings up some discrepancy in what appears to have happened. He never played Colombo big or over the top, but even so, his performance here appears much smaller than usual. The episode gets a little strange for a while now. We get a sort of extended montage of comedy sketches where Colombo goes to see a hairdresser, presumably to find out about Milton's haircut, but who refuses to answer any questions until Colombo gets a $25 haircut and manicure, which is still a lot more than I paid for my last haircut, and I didn't get my nails done either. The scene seems to only exist for the punchline of how ridiculous Colombo looks with a fashionable hairstyle. He then goes to see the watch salesman, who says he had to explain to Milton how to adjust the date, and which also ends with a punchline.
Oh, incidentally, I like your hair. Daryl?
Yes.
He then speaks with Phyllis, and it would appear as if this scene is also set up purely for comic effect, as Colombo manages to tear Phyllis's outfit. Two of these three scenes are completely superfluous and are perhaps a little broad for an episode of Columbo, even against some of the sillier comedy scenes they put in other episodes.
Well, thank you, Miss Brand. That's all the questions for today.
Thank you.
I think they also feel more obvious as they come all at once. Had they been a little more spread out throughout the episode, it might have felt a little less goofy. It also feels like a sharp tonal shift when the next scene is so serious, as Ruth goes to see Janie and hides a museum artifact amongst her things as she attempts to frame her niece for the double murder. Columbo speaks with Ruth again and explains the directions he found on Milton were actually instructions on how to set the date on his watch, which means he wasn't killed at the time he left the answer phone message, but much later, after midnight. This is a really clever way of breaking this part of the alibi, and it's a bit thrown away for such a smart piece of detection. I think they could have made it more significant. Ruth uses this opportunity to let Columbo know that before the murders, some things had gone missing from the museum, and Columbo suggests that maybe Janie is responsible for the murder, as she was having an affair with Dr. Schaefer and hired Milton to work at the museum.
No, I swear. I don't believe it. I swear to you, Lieutenant.
As a result, the police search the house and find the artifact. Jamie is subsequently arrested. It's pretty clear that this is part of the trap Columbo is setting, but in an effort to subvert that, we then have a scene of Columbo at the museum listening to the recording Edward was making on the night of the murders. His sergeant is concerned as he's been there for 7 hours, but he's convinced there's something on the tapes. The next day he goes to see Janie in prison and tests her by bringing the bag Schaefer used and the item they found in her room, as well as some cigarettes. She recognises the bag, but uses the artifact as an ashtray, which convinces Columbo she's being framed. I don't think these scenes work for seasoned Columbo fans, as it feels incongruous that he would set a clear trap to prove Ruth's guilt, but still need to prove to himself that Janie is innocent. It might have worked better if his sergeant had been the one to engage in the search of the house, like Wilson did in the Greenhouse Jungle. He also uses this opportunity to tell Janie that he suspects Ruth is responsible for the framing and for the murder of Janie's father, by giving him chamomile tea, which would have been dangerous for him with his heart condition. He then takes her home and tells Ruth and Phyllis he's releasing her. Janie then tells them everything Colombo suspects, and Colombo explains why. He plays the tape of Edward doing inventory, proving that the artifact wasn't stolen weeks ago, as it was mentioned on Edward's inventory. Ruth asks Colombo to admit he was lying about suspecting her of killing Peter Brandt, and indicates to him that she is willing to confess if he does so, which he obliges and escorts her out.
Tell her it wasn't true.
Yes, ma'am. It wasn't true.
It won't be necessary to use the tapes as evidence, Lieutenant.
This episode is interesting because in some ways it's very much Columbo, and yet in others it's just a touch off. The humour is a little too broad, almost sitcom-like. The scenes between Columbo and Ruth are different, but actually really interesting. What I dislike, though, is how manipulative Columbo was towards Janie. Using her to catch Ruth felt very un-Columbo. If Columbo believed that Ruth did kill Peter, and it's not clear he really does believe that, then he could still caught her without revealing that to Janie. She didn't need to be told for his gotcha to work. Also, it's a little inconsistent that Ruth is willing to commit all the murders she has and to frame Janie for them, then to spare Janie and Phyllis's feelings by getting Columbo to retract what he said about Peter, as if she now cares about her niece despite getting her arrested for a double murder. It's also not the most memorable of episodes. The only thing I recalled from the last time I saw this was the detail about the date on the watch. And it's a shame because the performances are all really good, particularly Joyce Van Patten. I just think it doesn't come together right, and for that reason I have to give it 2 out of 5. Thank you. Goodbye.